think there's room to be offended. This is the more pressing social need. I don't think violence is being done to people because a joke hits them the wrong way.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater-Adler, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater-Adler, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome back to the Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, here with Anne France. We're going to get to the podcast with Samantha, Daniel, and our guest, David Heti, who's actually a professor of comedy here in Montreal, in just a little while. But first, Anne France, hope you had a good holiday season. How you doing?
I certainly did. I'm feeling rested, recharged, and rebooted. I hope for all my fans out there and followers that you've had as awesome a holiday season as I. Certainly, we're starting the new year on a very lovely basis with a new mayoress, the first lady mayor in the history of the city of Montreal, which is awesome. Plus, it's an election year this year, provincially, so that's going to be pretty awesome. And at the same time, we're even going to have a new police chief, it looks like. So maybe we're going to have a clean sweep. Oh, dare I dream of a lady police chief?
Any update on the animal rights file? There's a couple issues that you've been tracking, of course, the pit bulls here in Montreal, and the calèche, the horse-drawn carriage industry, which appears to have suffered another blow recently.
Indeed. So first, to all my fellow animal rights activists and pibble-loving humans, I want to say this. I'm sure we've all enjoyed, I know I have, being able to take out our little pibbles outside without worrying about putting them in a harness and annoying the poop out of them. And now that we have restored freedom and good sense to governance in the island of Montreal, I want people to be doubly careful and respectful of other fellow Montrealers who can be afraid of dogs and who've lived for the last year and a half with this terrible publicity campaign against pit bull type dogs and have had fears stoked. And it's up to us to show everyone that we're responsible dog owners and that we are in control of our dogs. And whether your dog is a Chihuahua, a Poodle, a Great Dane, a Rottie, or a Pibble, you've got to keep in control of your dog. And let's not have any incidents while we're trying to rewrite the city's dog regulations so that the government can be reassured that we're going to put the responsibility where it belongs, and that's in the hands of every guardian and every dog owner.
And the calèche industry, the horse-drawn carriages, so that there's some good news there as well.
There's good news as well. The mayoress has confirmed on more than one occasion now that she's going to work to put an end to calèches on the roads of Montreal. Many of us of a certain age grew up where it was a very charming part of Montreal at a time where Le Vieux Montréal was pretty much empty of cars and was occupied mostly by pedestrians and horses and dogs, right? That has changed, and it's not fair to keep these horses on the road. Our mayoress is a sensible enough lady to want to do this carefully to protect the rights of the people who've been earning their livelihood as calèche riders. And I'm certainly in favor of throwing at least a few tax dollars that way to help people adapt and make the transition and ensure that all the horsies who are involved end up having lovely retirements and being placed with families who can adopt them and give them an awesome retirement.
Finally, the subject, unfortunately, you can't stick around for the podcast today. You have a big meeting coming up, but the topic is comedy, and we will come back to it soon, of course. You're a longtime fan of stand-up comedy, so the question is comedy funny anymore, or is the milieu becoming more and more careful about political incorrectness?
Well, we've had a little bit of an unfortunate effect here in the province of Quebec, a certain chilling effect on the essential liberty of comedians who are often the bastions of the concept of freedom of expression and of helping spread political thought and good political dissidents. And that's because of the case brought against Mike Ward. And I'm one of the champions who goes, "Free Mike, free Mike, free Mike," in more senses than one. But I don't think that's been the tendency in the more sensible parts of the world, including our poor beleaguered neighbors to the south in the United States, who, thanks to the great cretin-in-chief Donald J., have seen a veritable renaissance of comedy in their country. And the unbelievable quality of comedy coming out of that country is a function of having somebody in power who so doesn't have any sense of the right thing to say, who is so determined to insult and offend and denigrate and deprecate, that comedians show they can serve an awesome role to the country in pointing out what's wrong with politics by insult and what's wrong with denigrating and hurting other people deliberately when you have no sense of irony or sarcasm in your pitch, right? So I think, again, that the normal purpose of comedians is to offend and to push boundaries. But in this particular case, I think the comedians to the south of us are doing a great job of reminding us what good and polite and respectful discourse is by being so irreverent. I know that sounds oddly contradictory, but it is the strange reality we're living in and that we're going to continue to live in the year 2018.
Thanks, Anne France, and we'll catch up with you on the next episode. You have a big meeting to go to. You got to chat with, hang out with the mayor.
Yeah, I've been known to do that. It seems my influence now extends into the political world, and I will continue to flex those political muscles, especially when there's dogs and horses to save.
Well, thank you, and I'll let you go, and let's proceed now with the conversation between Dr. Samantha, Daniel, and their friend David Heti, who's a comedian who teaches a comedy course at McGill University here in Montreal. Is comedy funny anymore? On the Goldwaters.
So I was told to forget formatics in this radio show today, and just to dive right in and act natural. And if one can act natural, it's a bit of a oxymoron or a paradox. But speaking of paradoxes, we have my good friend David Heti here today. Say hi, David.
Hello, Daniel.
David is a good friend of mine. He's a comedian and also a lawyer. You still a lawyer?
No, not at all.
Okay, but he's trained as a lawyer and was once a lawyer, and then gave it up to be a comedian. And he's here to discuss comedy today with us, which is apropos. I'm also here with my regular old sister, who's not a comedian. Hi, Samantha.
Hi, I'm a woman, so I'm not funny.
No.
No.
And that said, it's exciting for me to do this podcast with David because not only do I like him in a way, but he's also more of an academic. You know, he's not a cruise ship type of comedian. He's a little cerebral, a little dark. So the reason why we're having this podcast today, really, and why we have David on, is I want to get into where comedy's at in the culture, political correctness, a certain sort of outrage culture out there on social media and on the interwebs has maybe put a muzzle on certain types of comedian, particularly David, who David's comedy deals with a lot of very dark subjects, such as misogyny, genocide, and so to start us off, I guess we'll defer to David. David's also just one last thing about him. He's also he teaches a class at McGill. Want to talk to us a bit about that? What do you do there?
Well, it's a class on comedy writing and comedy theory, basically. And it's a way to understand, like to situate what comedy sort of, like what philosophy of comedy, what it tries to achieve, what like its, its way of being is, and then sort of a little survey of historically the roles it's played in different theories, different thinkers, whatever, like, Bergson and Kierkegaard and different sort of understandings of the mechanism of comedy, and then because a writing class sort of going through joke and sketch and script, and so it's a general course on comedy.
Kierkegaard is really hilarious. People should go study his works. He's kind of like the Dane Cook of his time. Do you find that just over your career, how long has it been now that you've been actually a real comedian?
Maybe I don't know, 10 years or something like this.
10 years?
About that. Since starting out.
Okay.
Maybe 11 since very, very, very starting out.
He still has most of his hair?
Yeah, less.
Yes. But he, over 10 years now. And do you find that there's been maybe a shift in the culture with respect to how your comedy is received or comedy in general?
I mean, how my comedy is received is a question of how I've changed and grown and developed and responded to the culture. But I think generally, certainly, personally, I find it so exhausting today because I find that so much of what comics have to do is sort of they have to legitimate themselves. They have to justify the fact that they're doing comedy as they're going into it. And there's nothing to say that there's something, wrong with, or maybe it can be beautiful, in fact, addressing your form through your art itself. But there's something, I think, disgusting when there's this presumption that whatever you're doing is somehow illegitimate. And I find that so much more the comedy addresses what comedy is today than was the case before, when people came to a comedy show and they understood what was going on. They understood that this is a certain space in which this art form is being practiced, and we had this like social compact, and we know what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that a lot of the voices that are coming out, sort of taking issue with what's being said in comedy, they're not truly, like, they don't care about comedy. They have an outside agenda. They have their own sort of values, which they're trying to sort of advance. And that's like, I guess it's legitimate in one sense, but then I think that should remain in its own sphere somehow. Like, I think that's not helpful. I don't think this is a good time for comedy. I think this is a miserable time for comedy.
Well, let me ask you a little bit, because it seems almost counterintuitive. I think I know what you're getting at, but I want to poke you a little bit for specifics, because there's a lot of really big names in comedy now, and a lot of people, comedy news, especially in political commentary, has really, really taken off. And there's some of the biggest, most well-known names like Stephen Colbert, or even a Samantha Bee, or John Oliver, Trevor Noah. So where do you find that the culture is infiltrating, or that people are passing? What values are people trying to impose, or that you find people are trying to impose on comedy now that's restricting the art?
Okay, well, I think it's pretty, like, the fact that you mention all these political TV comics is like exactly the point where I think that comedy's become so politicized.
Did I just hurt your soul a little bit?
No, I mean, this is exactly what comedy has become. This is for one thing, this is the most mainstream comedy. This is like NBC, ABC, whatever. But what it's become is so divisive. And what these like late night hosts do is they constantly take one side of an issue and they they reinforce, they reinscribe people's ideas. Who's tuning into these things? It's the people who already agree with their viewpoints. And it's not like, I don't even think that the best comics, but you go to them because you're not going to find something new. You're going to be comforted. Which is like the opposite of what comedy is supposed to do, certainly, I would say, which is to play with ambiguity and create discomfort and confusion. And even that's what art does. I don't know, when's the last time you went to a play, and you were it wasn't sufficiently didactic or something. This is the most one-sided, simplistic comedy. I think it's a constant, it's not punching down or whatever that is, but it's certainly in one way, and that's simplistic, and it people are coming to, comedy's being dumbed down.
So you think people are coming to just not be challenged? So whatever their political views are, they're just coming to find a comedian that's going to reinforce what they're saying, and you find the audiences get offended or annoyed or block things. Like, things are only funny if I agree with you, and if I disagree with you, then F off, get off the stage. Right.
Yes, exactly. And what it does is it creates this environment where you come to sort of have your own views confirmed for you. This leads to greater divisiveness and lack of understanding. And I think you're supposed, and that's like a huge problem in culture, I think, today. And I think a lot of the problem with comedy, the way people receive comedy, is that this online, it's so binary. You like or you don't like, or you share or you don't share. And that's not the way that art operates. You're not supposed to be able to side so one-sidedly with something so complex at its best. And so I think that it's definitely a function of technology, that you don't really have, it's just about force and power. This is what these numbers online represent. When you have everyone who has an internet connection can somehow voice their outrage. And I understand that people say that, it's a way of marginalized and people without power being able to have a voice finally. But I think there's a different sort of, there's one idea of privilege where, it's whatever your demographic is. But another kind of privilege is certain people have won the right to speak. If you've put your time in, at school or you put your time in on the ground floor and you've been in comedy clubs for 30 years, I'm sorry, but you kind of have a little more validity or viewpoint. It's a little more informed.
Paid
Like,
your dues.
Yeah, I mean,
You
what
paid
the
your dues
hell?
where the audience has not paid their dues.
Well, yeah, like,
David,
art's not for everyone.
David, you're a white male.
Yeah, but the thing is, like,
But he's
But
Jewish.
there's so many, there's so many little gradations, and
What are the gradations? You're white and you're male.
okay, that's not the. I mean, I don't even. The thing is that also it's really a generational thing. I really do feel as though like it's not. We shouldn't even be looking at the Colberts and the Samantha Bees and whoever is on TV. We should be looking at the ground floor because who is like running these art spaces now. Like you have to look at this a little bit, I think, like in a Marxist way, like who owns the means of production, or, you know?
And the M word.
No, but because, you know, this question of like art exists unto itself as other plane, but also like the people who are running the very, very like the first spaces where you're able to do stand up, it's the students, it's young people, and because these are the people who have the time that, you know, and like the excess money to like run a room for free. You know, people have kids, they have jobs, they have responsibilities, but students, like, you know, it's like they're just running these rooms, and then so it's their values which you really have to conform to if you want to enter into comedy now and you want to be even on the indie scene.
Okay, but then let me push back a bit then, because that's all very conscious and complicated and intellectual and Marxist and all those things. I'm a simpler man. I'm a dime store intellectual. So you have to prove to me really that the change has come over the past generation. You alluded to that, right? Now, when I think back to, say, people, comics like, I don't know, Lenny Bruce or even George Carlin, I mean, you know, these were, you know, sort of very great comedians, great comics of their day and are celebrated today. And a lot of their material was still, I think the audiences that would show up for their material are not necessarily button-up conservatives that were there. I mean, the people that were coming for this type of comedy were people that were probably politically allied with them to a certain degree. Do you think that has some validity?
I think that what's different is that now, like before, I think you would have, like, I don't think, you know, Lenny Bruce had as wide a public audience as we might think today. Like, I think he got on TV once, and, you know, he basically, I don't think he was constantly, okay, I think the difference is that the cool kids back then were they were open-minded. They were open to, okay, because the people who like Lenny Bruce was shut down by the authorities, you know, by the man, basically. And this is that's the proper, you know, that's what the authorities are supposed to do. But here today we have the youth. We have the people who are supposed to be, you know, normally the students are the radicals. They're the ones who kind of try to open up the mind. And this is what I find so terrifying a little bit, that it's becoming like a clamping down.
Yeah, it's cannibalistic almost, right? I mean, so if I'm to take your comments a bit further, it's almost as if that this political risk-taking of youth culture, which tends to be more tolerant, say, of outsider ideas, have become so dogmatic in their ideologies that they're sort of eating their own. People that might be politically allied or just as open-minded, certain comics are trying to push the envelope, they will attack back because they're not following the doctrine of being woke enough or being sensitive enough to all the victims and snowflakes.
Well, I think there's definitely like much less room for sort of dissent or open-mindedness because you can't speak out online. You simply can't, because it's not about argumentation and an open-minded exchange. It's really about force and numbers and power. And I think what happens is like interesting art, I think, will question sort of whatever our art's values at that time. I mean, you know, if everyone's in agreement as to what is good, why are you going to see something called into question? Why do you go expose yourself to new ideas? And so I think that we're not even talking about a level of comedy. We're talking about a level of like this comes back to, I think, knowledge claims. It's like, who has a right to silence another person? And that is so fundamental. And people come to things they don't understand. Like they come to, you know, people don't understand. I don't know. Like they don't like there's this gut reaction when what art often does is it presents to you something in a complex light. or it presents to you the mundane in a new way, and you have to wrestle with that. And that's a legitimate purpose of it. And so people are trained in whatever, like, critical theory or whatever kind of studies they've taken, and they're not like art historians. Not that they have to be, but there's somehow you have to, like, you have to come to art in a way that's fair to what art is. Like,
You make this all sound very highfalutin. Let's use a real example to kind of get your hooks into this. Perhaps you've heard about the Mike Ward controversy. Mike Ward, Montreal comedian, got into a lot of trouble and, in fact, was fined by the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal for telling jokes about a disabled singer, Jérémy Gabriel, who, it should be noted, is not an adult, was not an adult, at least at the time that this event occurred. And he was fined by the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal. Should we be outraged, David? Is this a bridge too far? Is this...
the thing is, I think really, it's never fair to, like, judge an act you haven't heard. Like, I can represent it however I want. I can tell you one joke out of the whatever, maybe 3.5 minutes it was, and, like, for crying out loud, it's in French. Like, I don't even think that an Anglophone should be commenting on the nuances of maybe how his material.
Are we jumping into identity politics now that Anglophones don't have the right to comment on Francophone material?
I mean, no, this is not. This is about not understanding.
Appreciating the language and nuance. Yeah.
And I think this is what often happens. Especially, this is why you have so much outrage often, even if you see in print someone's joke, because the way that it's delivered, like, this is a whole part of what's being presented. It's a performance. So, but whether, I mean, like, so I don't want to go into the particulars of Mike's jokes, but in terms of when the law should come down, I mean,
should it ever? I mean, I don't know. I'm surprised you're equivocating. I would think that my view off the top is that Mike Ward should not be fined, even if he went up there and made disgusting, outrageous jokes, less nuanced than we might give it credit for. I don't think that a human rights tribunal should be weighing in. I mean, like David said, it's a safe space. I mean, let's use an expression. when you're a comic and you're going up there, I mean, it should be carte blanche.
Well, I think that you're also missing an important part of the story, which is that I think Jérémy Gabriel, he was teased and taunted mercilessly as a result of Mike Ward's jokes. Mike Ward is a very famous comedian, and I think we even brought to the point where he was suicidal. So this did have a real cost for this kid and on his life, that he was really quite miserable about the whole thing. Whether the law should come down or not is a different question, but there was a real harm done to a kid because Mike Ward thought this was funny.
And it's not that... You go on.
Well, the only thing to introduce, therefore, because obviously what this reeks of is punching down, right? It's not as if he's making fun of a political figure where we could assume that there's that they can take it, they're public figures, and so this kid is, again, a kid with a malady who didn't ask to be object of ridicule. So does that change something for you?
I mean, I don't think that there should be, like, I think that, rights and freedoms have to be balanced. That's how it works. There's no absolute right to, X in society, because we have to balance it with other claims. And so, I mean...
Does this pass that threshold in terms of balancing of the right of Mike Ward to free speech and to exercise of his profession, which is a particular one, versus the interests of this poor fellow, Jérémy Gabriel, who was made to feel suicidal and diminished and horrified?
Okay, I think certainly it's the laws. It's for the law and not just like the mob to come down and enforce like the limits of speech.
The law spoke. The Human Rights Tribunal, that's a legally created entity, last I checked. We're both lawyers.
Yeah, but like you're asking me to like make a legal argument about this judgment, about this.
It doesn't have to be legal. It could be from your gut or more lower regions.
I don't think this. I think this is. I mean, this isn't about punching down. I think, and this isn't. This. I think this is like a very like a sui generis case. This is like this you don't ever encounter. This is very little to do, I think, with the general sort of problem in comedy today, because what you have is people generally claiming that they have been really harmed and wronged, and I feel like
Sounds like a credible claim here. I don't think anyone has any reason to challenge its credibility here from this fellow, Mr. Gabriel.
Part of the issue that the Human Rights Tribunal took with Mike Ward's joke is that it had a specific identified person and was and the butt of the joke, not all the jokes, but several of the jokes were specifically targeted to about his disability, and that was part of and it caused a real harm, and that was part of their their multi-step ruling. But even if we take it out of the law, David, you have some interesting points that, I think as far as I understand it, is that it seems like you're saying that comedy used to be more of a safe space for comedians, and now it's more of a safe space for the audience, or that's how it's being structured, or that the audience is saying more, you need to, it's not okay for you to offend us and for you to say things that are controversial. We want you to agree with what we're saying. And has your comedy over the course of your comedy career, how have you adapted to the changing culture and norms?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that like a comedy space should be the space for comedy and comics. Like that's our place to play around. That's the place for people who want to play around with us. That's where they should come. And these are the values and like the understandings of this room or whatever. And I think that today you have to make much, like the comic has to extend much more like of a wink to show that no, I know what's going on. Like I'm not a terrible human being. We're here at an art space, and it kills the artfulness of what's going on.
But it's the neat partition of those spaces that I take issue with. Let's use you as a live example. I know very well, and you've spoken about this in interviews that you've done with the press, about your experience doing your internship at the Department of Justice when you were a younger, more bright-eyed lawyer-to-be. Though you were never bright-eyed, you're always jaded. And if I have this right, and I do recall because I was there with you holding your hand throughout the whole process. And
you were such an immense support, Daniel. David couldn't have done it without you.
He was crying in my chest.
Yeah.
And it was
he owes his whole career to you, Daniel.
Essentially, I invented David Heti.
Right? So David, thank you. Yeah.
But to brief our listeners that he had begun his internship at the Department of Justice as, a young attorney, and had disclosed the fact that he was a comedian, comic to his employers. But then some months later, they had discovered more of the subject matter of his stand-up routine, and they had essentially sent him a cease and desist letter saying that this violates our ethical guidelines here at Justice. And it was actually a beautiful letter. I remember, if you recall, I told you should frame it because it's pretty hilarious. It's on like official Department of Justice letterhead, and there's this bullet point list of all the themes that they found offensive, particularly rape,
Child molestation, genocide.
Right.
Yeah,
like,
what
a bunch of stiffs.
Hate, like, yeah.
Right. And
they just didn't get it.
And in poor old David's context, this was existentially quite the clash, right? Because there was essentially your professional life as an attorney, say your sort of maybe day job career that would have maybe have happened had you not abandoned it, and his sort of and maybe his other career, your passion as a comic, sort of clashing there. So my point being, coming back to partition of spaces, I mean, I take that you think that their decision was wrong to essentially ask you to sacrifice this material. Might have that?
Yeah, it was like just a fearful act of trying to protect their. Yeah, I mean, there's no legitimate claim to saying agree.
But you don't see, therefore, I mean, maybe their argument would be the overlapping of spaces, the fact that you are employed as with our government, it's a Justice Department of Justice job that you had, that you speak for that department. You're speaking when you act as an attorney. I mean, as we know, we're subject to. We have to obey our ethical guidelines. We have a code of ethics, and there are things that we can say in a public space that are considered that we can be called to task on.
In a public, yeah, okay, sure.
And is not a comic stand-up routine. I mean, it's a public venue. You'd say because they paid a ticket, it distinguishes.
I mean, what I said to them was that like it's absurd. Like no one would go to see The Godfather and actually think that Marlon Brando is like actually the Godfather, and now in your offices you have like this killer work, doing your paperwork. Like no right thinking, reasonable person is going to think this, and I think that we have to make allowance for the fact that there's space for like art. And I think that anyone who comes into the, like, I'm not spewing hate. I think you have to look at I don't know how complex it is to really genuinely appreciate what someone is communicating. Like, it's very easy to latch on to the simplest, most convenient interpretation and use it for your own ends, or to really genuinely appreciate what's before you. I mean, I even these like jokes about child this or that. It's like saying Schindler's List is a Holocaust film. Oh, so you're going to go see a movie about the Holocaust? So a movie can be complex just as a stand-up act, just as a sketch can, just as a painting can.
Well, but let's go a little bit further with this, because a lot of comedy can still be used as intentional instrument of social change or for political purposes. So even Daily Stormer, their style guide was leaked, and in it they.
What's the Daily Stormer?
Daniel, how about you? This is your specialty.
It's a white supremacist online
Dale loves the white
magazine.
supremacist sites.
I've been with them for a while.
And their style guide was released, and in there they explicitly advocated the use of comedy in order to make people more accepting of their racist nationalist messages. And they said it repeatedly over, even including what type of slur terms to use that would be most likely to for people to see, to be able to laugh off as just a joke and not take quite as seriously, but still kind of slip that message in until people are convinced. So comedy can definitely be a way to kind of lower people's guard to get in more problematic messages in there. And who is the person in there that is, because you're saying the society is going to kind of correct for this, so the audience going to react, and maybe the comedian won't get booked as much, or society is going to somehow determine which message is hateful and which is not. But then you're also condemning that same society who is saying that these messages are hateful and they don't want to hear it.
Well, yeah, because.
So when can you just take a joke? So when people say they're offended and they're like, I don't want to take this joke, I'm offended by this. When is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because now I'm thinking about the whole like Woody Allen thing, like who's behind this joke, and what's his White Stormer? White Storm?
Daily Stormer.
Daily Storm. Sorry.
Yes.
Daily Storm. I feign infamiliarity with, but Daily Stormer. So it matters.
Who's delivering the message, but you don't. Yeah. Oftentimes, you don't know who the person delivering it is. You're presented with the comic or just the joke, and you don't necessarily know. If I hear you doing stand-up, I don't necessarily know your personal history, and maybe I get it or I don't. Yeah, in terms of where your jokes are coming from. Maybe you actually are a pedophile. Maybe you think this is a great idea.
But I think I think it's different to say that this joke is coming from this like avowed, like known like
white supremacist
political group, yes, as opposed to presents as a male and of this age and this height and this, like, that's a different reading. That's assuming so much more about just your facticity than what I've said before and how I've played with whatever or whoever I am.
But it does make a difference, though. It does make a difference on a very basic. I can say. There are certain terms where it just is more okay for me to say than for somebody else. And so I can say kike and it could be funny and it could be okay, but someone who's a blonde hair, blue-eyed and of German ancestry can say kike, and it just has a very different feel and a very different meaning.
Don't feign innocence on this either,
it's not
David.
the meaning, the word isn't a problem, but the actual who's delivering it, what the underlying intentions, and those things can be really hard to tell. They can just be really hard to tell. A lot of times as an audience, we're just presented with the joke or the act.
I know, but there are some times when if you're going to a political rally and someone is using a certain word in a certain way, there's an understanding of what's going on that's different than if you're going to a movie.
So
and there can be
so if Daily Stormer just sent out their jokey henchmen and just without a big Daily Stormer tattoo across their forehead and just to go out and proselytize, essentially go to the comedy clubs, go to whatever, and because they're already advocating for the use of comedy, and comedy can be a very, very effective tool for social change and to get messages through. So if you don't know who the message is coming from, then
I think it takes, I think sort of the presumption has to be in favor of allowing the person in front of you to present themselves. Like you have to, as an audience member to whatever you go to, you have to be open to whatever's before you, and that means sort of holding back your own prejudgments. And then afterwards, it's totally fine to assess whether you like it or not. But I think it's a super high bar to understand when someone's being when someone has crossed this line such that you condemn them and you don't allow them to speak anymore.
Well, but some of those jokes can still be, you want to listen to the full act, you want to make up your mind after, you want to, go in, open hands without judgment. But there's still certain things where you can have, even Cosby, Cosby had, his Quaalude jokes where he was, where he had done, stand up many years ago talking about, very openly about
Spanish fly. Is how
Spanish fly. Drugging women to loosen their inhibitions so he could have sex with them. Everyone laughed. It was funny until we found out, oh, wait, he actually does that? That's a thing he really does? This wasn't a joke?
But, okay.
And where do you know? And maybe, I think part of the thing, and I don't know where the line is, and I grew up going to, comedy festivals and going to comedy clubs regularly. It's just part of where I came from, and our family has quite irreverent humor that other people often find offensive. And so, I feel comfortable in that space. But there is a certain part where I also recognize that humor can still be a way of kind of shifting norms a little bit and sort of poking in. And the more jokes you have, let's say, about, the deceased secretary who has no value just for her, other than her body, then that's still kind of...
There are certain comics that have today been accused of sexual misconduct that prior there was more ignorance about their ongoings, and one in particular is Bill Cosby, right, who had made jokes in the past about Spanish fly, as he said, about slipping into women's drinks downers to make them unable to consent to sex. This was part of his stand-up at some point when he was younger. And now, of course, we find out that it looks like he was doing that in his private life. Mm-hmm. Do you think that maybe bringing that sort of content into his stand-up might have played a role in a certain toxifying element, so that people, the audience was receiving something they were laughing at, which was horrible. Essentially, he was joking out loud about raping women.
Was it not an aphrodisiac? I don't recall the jokes, but I thought it was more along that line than like a...
No? You can listen to
Really?
stand-up.
Really?
No, it was
he says to
about-
loosen their loosen their inhibitions,
Okay.
like not to get them more aroused, to get them
Okay.
So then the point really comes
more
down
susceptible to him.
Not a Cosby fan ever. I mean,
Yeah.
before, after.
So you're safe. You're okay.
Yeah, thank God. Yeah.
But I mean, the Bill Cosby example might exhibit how sometimes comic material can play a certain role in the culture. Sort of.
I think what you're getting at is that there can be ways that when whether the comedians themselves are acting on these things, that the jokes that they're creating in real life, they may be loosening inhibitions in the audience or getting the audience to accept certain things that they, sort of shifting those sort of social norms. Because you're talking about, where comedy can have a really valid and really important kind of purpose in terms of shifting political discussion and opening, having people question things. But on the other side, if you hear a really funny joke about something about a guy, grabbing a woman's breasts or drugging a woman, then maybe that kind of convinces the audience that, hey, maybe it's, it just shifts them slightly to maybe it's not so bad, or at least I laughed at this, and so maybe when the guy in my class is joking about this stuff, maybe I should laugh too, maybe it's okay. Like even Al Franken in the pictures, he has two pictures of him groping women's breasts, and he has a big smile on his face, he's obviously hamming it up, he's doing this as a joke, but he's still, can you say he's not normalizing sexual assault through his...
Is he normalizing sexual... I mean,
he's making it funny.
But, again, you have to... I think that it's just a question of, there's no hard line as to when you have to read the intentionality. You have to read meaning into... These are all like speech acts, you have to read a person in front of you. So whether there is some real maliciousness in a joke, for instance, is something ephemeral.
But then can an audience call it out? Is it reasonable for an audience to say that, Because there's two different ways that you can take it. You can either take it as, well, the comedian is just joking, and for whatever reason thinks this is funny or this is poignant social commentary, and so they're introducing something, salacious. Or you can say, well, they're doing it with some hidden malicious intent and they have some underlying agenda. But frankly, either way, the fact remains that you still may have a comic on stage who may be saying something that could be intentionally or unintentionally influencing people in potentially a harmful direction.
Pushing the envelope.
I'd say more often than not, it's the audience members who have that hidden agenda. It's they who bring their own sort of, their sort of, like everyone's always thinking of how am I responding to this? How am I going to respond to this? I think there's room to be offended. This is the more pressing social need. I don't think violence is being done to people because a joke hits them the wrong way, and they think that they have to be offended on behalf of someone else who's like them or has a shared experience. And it's like, no, because they just have a better sense of humor, or they're okay with like the idea that there's something they don't like. I don't understand what it takes to tell someone. I guess I told one person one time that they can't tell a certain joke, but like really, this idea that all art has to be for you personally, and you have the right to go online and shut someone down? Like,
well, hold on, they have a right to reaction. Any audience does. I mean, it's funny how you really don't let the audience off. It's always the audience's fault in every single reaction that you're having. Let me use a current example that maybe might be illustrative. I mean, you're no doubt aware of the backlash against Kathy Griffin over her joke of having a photo of herself holding a severed Trump-looking head. Mm-hmm. And everyone really jumped down her throat, particularly, of course, on the right. But do you think that might be a little too far in terms of as an example of political comedy?
I mean, do I think it's too far?
I mean, it's very stark. No. There's not a lot of reading in, I think, that has to be done. It's a photo of a comic holding a severed, bloody head of the president.
Whether it's a good joke, whether it's done artfully, whether it's I find it funny is one thing. Was it too far? How is it too far? What's too far about this?
Well, that it is destroying social mores in a way that might be damaging to social cohesion. You're talking about a head of state of a country, and essentially, pretty plainly, joking about murdering them in a very disgusting, brutal way.
Well, let's go even further with this. Let's go beyond the individual audience member being offended and saying, I don't want to hear stuff I'm offended by. Mm-hmm. And let's say, for argument's sake, and there is some actual evidence for this, but let's just, push it a little forward, that there was evidence that by virtue of hearing these types of messages, by hearing messages, especially or even if in a comedic intent, that are advocating violence or sexual assault, that people who hear this are more likely to support these views or to go along with them. Mm-hmm. Would it then be the comic's responsibility then to be mindful of the effect that their jokes are having?
So you're saying there's actually some causal effect and people are more likely now to act out violently?
I don't think in terms of Kathy Griffith. I'm saying that there is some, I'm asking kind of, again, where the line is. There is some evidence in terms of, there is research that by witnessing media depictions of violence, for example, that people are more likely to act out violently. And so I'm not sure if there's something specifically for comedy that, I'd have to get into the research. I don't know, but it makes sense. People, advertising is like $1 trillion industry. So we know that by presenting people with a message nicely gift wrapped in a sweet way that's going to get them to lower their inhibitions and get them to listen, that they're more likely to follow through on that message.
It's very hard for me to think of these jokes about certain very touchy subject matters which actually advocate in a harmful way. It's like saying, so we won't have a depiction of a movie about Rwanda. Like we can't represent anything terrible in life in any way.
That's not the argument. The depiction of, say, a film like Hotel Rwanda or any a bunch of
It's
Holocaust
obviously a very
films.
negative depiction of it.
Yeah, I mean, the material kind of speaks for itself. I mean, and none of it, I don't think, unless you come up with an example, is glorifying the murder of innocents. These films are, if anything,
Yeah.
played from a very clear political point of view.
Yeah, there's a difference between watching a movie that's depicting or watching a photograph that's depicting a woman who's devastated by sexual assault or something, and watching Al Franken give like a thumbs up pretending to grab some woman's breast with a big smile on his
Right, or
face.
Kathy Griffin, just a still image of her holding the severed head of a president. There's no real longer narrative to unpack there.
Right. Okay.
And arguably, I mean, to Samantha's point about media obviously having an effect on social consciousness and social and actual translation to
as
actions.
it's designed to. It's
Right.
supposed to.
I mean, not to go too far afield, but you invoked Rwanda. I mean, we know very well that it was a lot of Hutu radio shows that kind of got people really rallied up, calling Tutsis cockroaches and stuff like that. I mean, what might be seen as sort of shock jock radio material, perhaps, might take on a life of its own. And vulnerable people can bear the brunt.
You have to allow art and debate and like in conversations in higher institutions of higher learning to question what's around, and it's just an exchange. I can't help it if someone hears a joke and they're like, oh, now I got to take this point of view. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking to the dumbest person in the room.
Well, it's not the dumbest person in the room. It's just subtle shifts, and you can still acknowledge that. There's even a philosophical psychological principle, foot in the door technique, which is involves getting the person to agree to a large request by getting them to agree to successively smaller requests beforehand. And so if you start off very small, then people are much more likely to go to this much bigger place eventually. And there's cognitive dissonance, of course, which is that if you find yourself laughing at something, for example, if you find yourself really amused and having a great laugh at Al Franken grabbing a woman's boobs, then hey, why not go grab your friend's tits for some laughs and take a selfie with them? Because, it's funny and it wasn't that big of a deal before. It doesn't mean that you're the dumbest person in the room. It just means that things shift very subtly. It doesn't mean you're going to see that photo of Kathy Griffith with Donald Trump's fake severed head, or the photo of Al Franken grabbing women's breasts and say, okay, now I'm going to go out and become a serial murdering rapist.
Mm-hmm.
But it may just, shift you slightly in problematic directions.
I mean, I'm not sure. So this is where you do a balance of rights and freedoms. You're gonna ban whatever, you're gonna Tropic of Cancer or whatever. You're gonna shift like this is a prurient, and I mean, I think that ultimately in the big picture, society is far better off when we give people, artists, more freedom in this way.
So we can have more of the debates, and just to clarify, I'm not advocating for censoring comics and that we shouldn't have controversial humor or salacious humor. It's just it's an interesting discussion. So thank you, David. I appreciate
so happy
this.
to have this conversation.
Thank you.
No,
right.
But you've also, but I mean, just to jump back on you though, I find that you have completely rejected the notion of artistic responsibility. I mean, you mentioned, for example, that comics or public personalities like Stephen Colbert, Samantha Bee, and Trevor Noah with political style humor, those are mainstream figures, right? And so they have a listenership, an audience, right? And that it's very large, and that it might behoove somebody to think about the consequences of the material. I mean, right now where you operate, it's a different audience. You're not as big yet as someone like Stephen Colbert. But I mean, when you craft your material, do you never cast your mind to the consequence that this type of material might have on your audience? I mean, if you had arguably, say, if you're tuned in prime time to American audiences across the country, across, say, the continent, would you not then think differently about what type of material you would craft? Because this material might, not just in terms of getting the yucks, but in terms of this material might be corrosive to the society that I want to live in. Maybe certain people can handle it. Maybe you're rarefied audiences of,
intellectuals who are debating.
Yeah, open-minded, libre penseur type. But, I mean, would you not want to maybe think to shift the material based on the harm it may cause?
The harm it may cause.
Have you ever cast your mind to that?
The harm of like what you're saying?
Well, the materials that you were called to task on when you're working at Justice. I mean, material that without going into anything too explicit, but themes of child rape or genocide.
But this is very, very simplistic. like saying what I mean. You can say it's about like
there's nuance.
self-deceit, or it's about sort of hypocrisy, or it's like I mean, you can label any joke any way you want.
Yeah, but don't feign ignorance either, David. I mean,
But
when
it's
you're pushing the button.
It's an oversimplification.
It's a
That's all.
simplification.
You know that as well.
I love your stand-up. I'm not going to say. I mean, I'm a big fan of it, and I find it funny. But do I think that other people should listen to your material? No, I don't think that a lot of people can handle it. I don't think that. No, I'm saying this just very basically. Of course, at the very least, it's adult humor. I would not have my nieces listen to it. And
because children perhaps.
Yeah, I don't think the 2 and 5-year-old your 2 and 5-year-old nieces, my lovely daughters, they're brilliant, but I don't think they would get it totally at
They're
this
children.
point.
They're not adults.
Yeah, they
That's a
wouldn't
little-
understand. They wouldn't appreciate the humor behind pedophilia. They just don't get it.
Yeah, but if I
One
saw
day,
you,
no, I'm teasing. I'm
if
teasing.
I
I
saw
know
you
that
present
there's
that type of material on a late night show, which has viewership in the millions,
Yeah.
I would probably like, David, look, that material's like a bit too edgy for this audience, and it might lead to you being misconstrued and misinterpreted and falling on wrong people, wrong gears.
But again, this is the absolute most populist humor you're talking about. But when the kind of stuff that I do is like, even on the ground floor where you're supposed to have like people, the wildest ideas, then it's like that's dangerous. I think that's dangerous for a society, and I think that it's not children coming out to these places. It's like,
But it's not just wild ideas. They're not like a heroic narrative. I've heard you invoke it sometimes in private conversation that you're sort of our court jester. You're there to sort of knock off hats and make people double think about things that they've taken for granted. There's a certain romanticization of the comic and what his or her role might be in society. So it's like having it both ways. It's not like, I'm there at the ground level coming up with the most outrageous, wild ideas I can. But it should be, I imagine, often buttressed by a notion that these insights to these jokes, as wild as they are, should have some sort of artistic merit. And that merit is probably defined by to what extent it makes people more conscious or...
I think that you have to, like, the comedy is about, it's not about the subject matter, it's about sort of, the comedy itself, maybe the limits of what the comedy is supposed to be. So you can have people pushing the bounds of propriety on late night television. It would just be narrower. But I think than a club. But I think that the problem is that people are quicker now to disallow the playing even of the questioning of their values. Like, here's a joke of mine which goes over well. It doesn't, it's like, it's a crowd pleaser. Okay, it's an old joke. Like, my girlfriend absolutely refuses to use any form of birth control whatsoever. And it's really changed my world to know that now each time I have sex, there's a real possibility of me bringing about not only a brand new life, but also a single mother. Okay, that's the joke. Mm-hmm. And you can be like, oh, what a terrible person.
I'm clutching my pearls right now.
Abandoned like single mothers. That's a horrific thing. And it's like, some people can take that view of it, and others, will get that it's a joke, and that I'm not actually advocating for that. So is that a joke that does violence to people? Is it a single mother joke? Like, how do you qualify this?
And I can see where that sort of straddles the line, where it's saying that, potentially it's a bad thing to do that, or that, that's something to consider when we're thinking about birth control and other stuff, that there's...
But then it's okay to play a fool on stage.
Yeah.
So that's a totally, like, that's the joker, the jester on stage.
But whatever clown you choose, though, is often just an exaggerated version of the real person, right? I mean, the fact that you had to come up with that joke from the infinite jokes that are out there has to reflect something within you. And perhaps you're making more fun of your fact that you are a comic and live sort of week to week.
You don't know how I live anymore, Daniel. It's been a long time.
No, it hasn't been. No, I'm sullying your reputation. But the notion that you're making fun of yourself, sort of like the irresponsible male, perhaps is embedded in that joke. So who are your influences, David, being a comic? You must have some.
I mean, I think that the ones that stand out really are like super young, not even stand-up comedy, but things like the Garbage Pail Kids. You know those stickers? Like something which just perverts, like subverts your worldview, and you're like, oh, like there's like grotesquerie, or you can show the ugly in life. Things like Monty Python, which was so absurd and just like shows like there's no seriousness there. They're always cutting down the businessmen, and in London City or whatever, so what else? Mad Magazine, like totally subversive. So, but particular jokes, I think it's when you reveal something grave, like you reveal like a grave issue to like have like it dissolves when the problems dissolve. Like you build up this tension, and then you're shown that like life is kind of miserable. Life is can be shit, And I think that comedy at its best kind of looks at this and takes what we always struggle with on a daily, and then just shows it to be kind of something we can overcome through humor. And I'm not saying that I don't have any respect for like silly humor, because I appreciate it, I enjoy it, but even that takes sort of our truths, like slapstick, like it takes our bodily integrity and causal world, and it turns it upside down, and you can delight in like subverted expectations. So I don't know. I mean,
it's interesting because psychoanalytically, humor is considered one of the mature defense mechanisms. So it's supposed to be something that does really, in terms of a greater purpose, does really help us to process and get through even some really painful and difficult experiences or things in our lives. And as I'm kind of poking in and bringing kind of academia in it, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your class? Tell us about your class, David. I want to know.
All right. Well, I guess the thing is that anyone can take it. You don't have to be a McGill student. So it's 6 weeks. It's twice a week at McGill. It's like once a year. And
come on, sell it. Sell it hard.
I mean, basically, you come out having to
funny.
You come out sort of understanding comedy much better, I would say. And it depends who's coming and taking it. Feedback and writing, and it's a real sort of engagement with like these issues, and it's like practical as well. But one thing, can I say one thing?
Yeah, please.
Okay, the last scene of Life of Brian, for instance, in Monty Python, when they're all on the they're all being crucified, and they sing about look on the brighter side of life, look on the bright side of life. Like this to me is like an amazing, like this joke brings like tears to my eyes, like because it's so like horrific, and it's so true that like life is shit, and and it's short. I mean, it's a different joke, but that they can find something good in it. But you're finding something good in it, you're also having to despair because it's so short. Like you can overcome the horror of life, I think.
But at least you can laugh at it.
Well, that's kind of because what the hell else are you going to do? So, I mean, very cliche, but like, I mean, kind of.
You're a very sad man.
Well.
And on that note, David, it's really been truly a pleasure having you here. It's been a really great discussion, and I appreciate the mix of it feels kind of funny having like a sober discussion about comedy, and I really appreciate you bringing that to us. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. I enjoy I'm a listener.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy it very much. These are things I've heard from you before, and you great.
Yeah, I think.
I grate you.
Yeah, you get on my
nerves. And how can people find your class? So for people that are interested and they're like, I want to sign up for a class with this guy, David Heti.
Just Google my name in McGill and go listen to an album. That's the best presentation of any idea.
How can we find your album or the Googles? What is the Googles?
It's called It Was Okay. You can go listen to it there. That's on iTunes and all these places. It Was Okay. That's the album, and that's where all these issues are dealt with in the proper way, which is through comedy. Because I'm not, because that's the training. That's the best way of representing what's going on.
I was just listening to the album this morning, and it was really it's a trip. I see what you're saying. I appreciate having listened to it before before recording this podcast, because it just gave a way to be able to see. You talk a lot about the story arc and how that comedy isn't necessarily just individual jokes, but it's the overall kind of message and story that you're trying to tell. And I thought that was really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Thanks a lot.
So So Daniel, that's our conversation on comedy with David Heti. His class is at McGill if you want to look him up, and he's also a regular, performs at clubs in Montreal and Toronto. What are your thoughts? You've known him for many years. Are you surprised to see him sort of become, I guess, one of the deans now of Canadian comedy?
No, I'm not surprised. I've always loved his material. I find him really edgy, but also very studied. You know, it's not just that the material makes me laugh. I mean, he's built a character. He's built his own clown. He's honed it, and yeah. And I have known him for a good long time. And there's always been a sort of funny tension between the two of us that I don't know if either of us knows, like, if we're joking or not. But like, we both kind of like to take the piss out of each other in a way. More me taking the piss out of him. And part of it, and we've explored this together, in fact, on a podcast he once had, in fact, called I Have a Problem with David Heti, which people should check out, where I confront him about this, that I sort of feel he's a class traitor to lawyers, and that he's kind of given up the sort of heroic calling of pushing paper to go out and make an ass of himself on stage. So I have this unresolved sort of antipathy towards him and his life choices that are, of course, a self-reflection of my own shortcomings and self-hate.
Very good. Any recommendations for further reading this week? Any material that you think people should consume on comedy?
Well, you know, oddly enough, a film that comes to mind, and I often go for films, are there's a film, The King of Comedy, which is a Martin Scorsese film, I believe 1980s, maybe 82 or mid-80s, and it stars Robert De Niro in a role that he's never come close to since in terms of like the character that he created, but essentially he plays this sort of pathetic stand-up who aspires to be one of the greats, and he's obsessed with Jerry Lewis in the film, who's one of the greats. And he is essentially a very sad, pathetic man who's very socially awkward and is sort of a stalker. and it sort of plays on themes of the pain, I think, that every comic that is resident, I think, in a lot of comics. So it's a very fascinating film, and people forgot it. It's Scorsese filmography, and it's very much on point. So King of Comedy.
Don't forget the Goldwaters.ca. We can check out Samantha and David Heti's picks as well for further reading if you want to check that out. Don't forget our social media pages on Facebook and Twitter. You can hashtag the Goldwaters. Thank you, Daniel, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Sure.
Okay, I mean this, yes, but yes, okay. There have to. It's you know, we have to take this, like, you know, someone who has you know, some affliction in their life, like it's there are people who I don't even know how to like. I know what you're saying, but I think there's room to be offended.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.